I'm going to just kind of give a quick overview of the agenda. Then we're going to walk into some introductions. So first on the agenda is to go through some introductions. We've got a lot of great folks to speak with us this evening. Then we're going to transition into sort of a big picture overview of the state of the state's education finance system today. We're going to move from there into a little bit of an overview of how the system works. We're going to talk about some specific issues that have driven property tax rates up considerably in some towns. And then we're going to transition into the future. We're going to talk about Act 46. I'm sure many of you have heard about Act 46. You're beginning to read more about it, learn more about it. And the purpose here this evening is really to provide a high-level overview of what Act 46 is, what it's not, what it's all about, and how we're going to move forward. So before I start with introductions, by the way, I'm Oliver Olsen. I'm the state representative for Jamaica, Londonderry, Stratton, Weston, and Winhall. And I'm sort of curious, a show of hands, how many folks are from one of those 5 towns? Okay, great. Okay, how many folks are here from Londonderry, out of curiosity? Okay, so quite a few. And folks, how many folks are school board members from outside of this general area? Okay, good. So we've got a mix. How about educators? Great. Okay, so we've got a great mix of folks here this evening. So I'd like to start with some introductions. So as I mentioned, I represent those 5 towns up in the Vermont legislature. And we're really fortunate this evening to have 2 special guests. Dave Shap, who's the chair of the House Education Committee. Dave and I served on the Ways and Means Committee, my last term in office. We've worked together over the years on education finance issues in particular, and education issues more broadly. And also joined by Shap Smith, who's the Speaker of the House. So, so Dave, if you give a little, I'll turn it over to you and say a few words, and then pass the baton to Shap.
So I represent northeastern Addison County, Bristol, Lincoln, Starksboro, and Moncton, and there is a 5th town in our 5-town area, New Haven, that all feed Mount Abraham Union High School. So we're a supervisory union that could move relatively easily into a supervisory district. We do, however, have some major concerns and conflicts within the district that I think that Act 46 would address in terms of crossed lines of authority and responsibility that make running any school district in the state difficult. And I've served in the legislature for, this will be my 14th year on transportation, local government, Ways and Means, and then in this last session, the Speaker decided to combine the responsibilities of financing education and policy in education. And so I moved from the Ways and Means Committee. We had 2 new members in the Education Committee that came from the Appropriations Committee. So we're trying to look at education in a more holistic manner, which I'm appreciative of.
My name is Shap Smith. I represent Morrisville, Elmore, Worcester, and Woodbury in the legislature. This will also be my 14th year. I came in with Dave, and this has been my 8th and last year as Speaker of the House. You know, one of the things that we have been looking at over the last 14 years I've been in the legislature has been education finance. It's a perpetual issue, and it's a real challenge to figure out how we're going to fund education. And when I talk to my colleagues from around the country, it's a challenge for them as well. But one of the things that has become a bigger challenge on the other side of the coin, other than finance, has been what do we do about declining school student enrollment throughout the state, the varying challenges that districts are facing throughout the state, and the disparity in educational opportunities that are coming to the fore throughout the state. Educational opportunities were supposed to be converging with the passage of Act 60 and 68, and it was supposed to equalize those opportunities throughout the state. And it has given, I think, greater resources throughout the districts in the state, but it has not always led to similar opportunities. And we're seeing increasing pressure, particularly in areas outside of Chittenden County and Washington County, with schools that have hollowing out of the student populations and having a hard time maintaining their schools. So for instance, in the upper White River Valley, we have Granville, Hancock, who've closed their schools and now tuition their kids to Ripton. And they still have school boards and school districts, but the only say that they have in the education of their children in Ripton is how much are they going to write a check for the tuition. They don't have a voice in the decision-making around the school. And that's happening more and more frequently around the state as people are having to make decisions about whether they're going to keep their schools open. That has led to the conversation around, should we expand school districts so that kids in neighboring communities throughout the state with imaginary lines that separate them have similar opportunities to the ones that live on the other side of that imaginary line. And let's be frank, these are really difficult conversations that are wrapped up in our notions of ourselves and our notions of community and our notions of the history of the state of Vermont. We also need to be frank that this is not a unique conversation. We've been having these conversations throughout the history of this state. We went from many towns that had one-room schoolhouses, many of them throughout their state, and that when there were closure of, say, 4 one-room schoolhouses in that town and a consolidation into one school for that town, it was the end is nigh, education is ruined forever. And yet we have been able to get past the closure of those, and we've had similar discussions with union schools. We are at that point in time again. And what Act 46 is about is facilitating those conversations and trying to address the real challenges that we have throughout the state. And I know, based on the feedback, that not everybody agrees with the direction that we've taken. And probably that's true for many of you in this room. And the reason that Dave and I and many legislators from around the state are going to forums around the state about Act 46 is to get the feedback. Because the beautiful thing about this state is that you can have the Speaker of the House and the Chair of the Education Committee in a room with you and have conversations about what's concerning you and what you hope for. And in this state, there is often responsiveness to those concerns. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Oliver. Thank you for all being here tonight. It's a real privilege for me to be in the southern part of the state.
So just continuing on with some introductions, we also have a number of other legislators. I counted at least 3. Senator Alice Nitka, who represents Londonderry and most of, if not all of Windsor County, including the town of Weston. Alice, I don't know if you want to just raise your hand or stand up.
Alice Level. And yeah, I represent all of Windsor County, Londonderry, and Holly.
Great, great. And Representative Ann Manwaring, I saw you somewhere.
Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax. We also completed a joint contract consolidation between 2 towns for K-12, and it took us 10 or 15 years to do it, but it's done, and it's a good school now. We now have to get into the other morass that we're going to talk about here today.
Representative Emily Long, who serves on the House Education Committee, and I should point out Ann does as well.
Emily Long, I'm from Newfane. I also represent Townsend and Marlborough, as well as Newfane, and I'm a freshman legislator on House Ed.
Did you say? And Lee Dakin?
Did you see Robert Chestnut?
I'm Lee Dakin from Chester. I represent Andover, Baltimore, Chester, and a bit of Springfield.
And several years ago, when consolidation came up before, our supervisory union consolidated with Black River. So we are the Two Rivers Supervisory Union now, and include Ludlow, Mount Holly Elementary, Chester, Andover, and Cavendish, and Green Mountain.
Great. And Representative Robin Chestnut-Tangerman.
I represent the towns of Paulette, Wells, Hooper, Middletown Springs, and 3/4 of Timoth. Timoth so big they had to split it.
Yeah.
And here, mostly in a listening capacity to see how this is working, where it's working.
Great. And the chairman of the State Board of Education, Stephen Morse, was here. Ah, there we go.
Am I supposed to say who I represent, or? I'm from Newfane, and I used to serve in the legislature as well. But I really want to commend you for pulling this group together, and I'm really impressed that you got the chair of the House Education Committee and the Speaker of the House in the same room in the middle of the week during off session. It's really commendable that both of you worked so hard getting this legislation through, all three of you, along with other people, but it's pretty impressive that you're here tonight. This Act 46 is obviously a very historic piece of legislation, and it's I would just echo what the speaker said, that we all really need to work together to make sure that we implement it in a favorable way. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's talk a little bit about the big picture in terms of the statewide fiscal situation as it relates to education. And the question I get a lot, and I think all legislators get, is what are we doing to fix the funding system, right? Everybody, at least everybody in my district that I know, hates the funding system that we have. And I threw up this quote from former U.S. Senator Russell Long, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree." And I really think that's apropos to the challenge that we're facing in Vermont. Yes, our funding system needs to be fixed, but merely fixing the funding system is not going to address the underlying structural challenges that we're facing as a state. So part of what Act 46, and we'll come to Act 46 in a bit, looks to accomplish is to focus on those structural challenges and really sort of shore up the foundation, which we need to do before we can really take a meaningful look at the funding mechanism. So just, basically we spend $1.5 billion a year, $1.6 billion a year on education. It's raised through a variety of sources, and it's a mix of residential property, which is the property that you as a homeowner live in, which is roughly 28% of our revenue stream, $400 million bucks. And then $600 million through what's known as non-residential property, which is basically business property, second homes, seasonal camps, that kind of thing. And then there's about 20%, $300 million that comes out of the general fund. And that's a fancy way of saying the income tax. It's basically the income tax. We take a slice of the income tax revenues and we move it over into the education fund. A little bit of sales tax and some other miscellaneous revenues, but you get an idea. If we look at what we spend on pre-K through 12 education in this state as a percentage of gross state product, the last data we had last year was 2011-12. We're at 5.2%, the highest in the nation. And this really speaks to the challenge we have with tax capacity. There's only so much money that you can basically raise through any tax, whether it's a property tax, an income tax, etc., as a percentage of the overall economy. The U.S. average, incidentally, is 3.4%. So we've all heard about some of the demographic challenges we're facing as a state. We're an aging state. We're the second. We have the second oldest population after Maine, and we started to see those demographic challenges. We're starting to see the impact on our tax base. And these are some statistics I pulled from the tax department from 2005 to 2013. The number of tax returns filed by tax filers under age 65. This is this is an erosion of our tax base on the income side. We've obviously seen challenges with property values and that as a tax base. But we are seeing these demographic challenges not only play out in our tax base, but we're seeing them play out in the number of students we have in our education system. Essentially we have seen a decline of something like 20% of our student enrollment over the last number of years, yet our total education expenditures continue to increase. So we have a system that is out of balance and has not been responsive to the shrinking population of students that we're serving. Meanwhile, while the student numbers go down, our staffing levels have remained constant, and staffing is 80% of education spending. We've heard things like it's heating, fuel costs, and things like that. It really comes down to staff levels and the cost of staff. So, this is a slide that I can't take credit for. It actually came from the Agency of Education, and this speaks to the impact, or the potential impact of managing staff attrition within the education system. We currently have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, student-to-staff ratio in the country of about 4.67 to 1. If we were able to round that off just through retirements, we would be able to save $74 million a year. $74 million on a $1.5 billion system. That, in terms of property tax rates, that's equivalent to about 7 cents on the property tax rate. And again, we're not, this isn't about, going in and making large-scale cuts. This is just managing existing attrition. So I'd like to just pause at this point before we go further and just open it up for questions and comments.
Can you talk about sort of you said that the stability here is in the faculty numbers, the staff numbers, and that's about 80% of those costs, and yet those costs have been rising dramatically. And that, as an educator, I know that one of those big rising costs is in healthcare, and the healthcare increase rates are typically 8 to 10% a year. So how can we control that as a vehicle of managing some of these larger costs? Is there something that we can get at with that?
Well, healthcare expenses are part of the overall compensation expense, and what we find typically in the private sector is, typically staff are sharing a greater percentage of those healthcare expenditures than they do in the education system. So, as a form of compensation, it's sort of hidden away. Healthcare is a big item. It's a big driver of costs across the state. There is no magic bullet, as I think we've seen with our recent foray into healthcare reform in this state. At the end of the day, we're just spending more money on healthcare, and that is a driver. But again, I go back to, we have declining enrollment, but we're not right-sizing the system to accommodate that decline. We're keeping the staff levels constant, and with inflationary increases, including healthcare, it pushes the overall expenditures up. Great question. Dwayne.
Oliver, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right. As a former school board member, your student-to-staff ratio, some of the problem with that is there are more identified special ed issues these days, and so does that take into consideration of that the demands on the education system are different than they were even 5 years ago. So we have situations where it's a one-to-one. We have a specific staff member for a specific child, and those are mandated by federal and state regulations. The school board and the school has no control over that.
Absolutely. So special education is a component of overall education spending, and relative to overall education spending, the data that I've seen, it's definitely increasing at a faster rate than overall spending, but it's not the key driver. Brandon.
Yeah, Oliver, I don't know if you have the data or if this is something you're going to go into later, but talk to me about how we as a state measure up to other states and how much we're compensating our staff at these years.
I don't have the data at my fingertips. We're not the highest, we're not the lowest. I think we're somewhere, in the middle. And Dave, I don't know if you have a quick answer to that one.
So we're lower on average than any state in the Northeast except Maine, and we're lower than the national average. So on an individual staff member in our buildings, our compensation is not high in general. The problem is the number of staff people.
One quick question on
Yep.
the 80% staffing that you talked about there, the monies, does that include any, it includes benefits, it includes salaries?
That's fully loaded.
Does that include any pensions or anything like that in that number?
That's fully loaded.
So that includes teachers that are not active right now, that is 80%.
Well, what they're paying into their retirement fund. I mean, that's a rough.
Does that include paying out there? No, what they're paying into it?
No. All right, so I'm going to talk briefly. There are a number of folks from Londonderry here, and I just to be perfectly frank, Londonderry education tax rates went up 12% for residential property owners, and I know I've certainly got quite a few calls on that, and I do want to just sort of walk through an explanation of what's been driving that. And it's really hard to do that without at least a high-level overview of how the system works. So, as far as education funding goes, I think most of the confusion that I encounter as I'm speaking with members of the public is a lot of folks still think of education funding in terms of how it worked 20 years ago, pre-Act 60. And the most common misconception is to think in terms of the size of the grand list and the budget, and approach it from that perspective. And if there's one thing you can all walk away, I hope you can all walk away from this meeting tonight, is you need to understand that what drives your local property tax rate is your per pupil spending. Nothing to do with your grand list, nothing to do with the size of the budget. You could be Burlington with a multi-million-dollar budget, or you could be the town of Stratton spending $500,000. The tax rates for the same per pupil spending are going to be identical. It's per pupil spending is the key thing to always be looking at. So what drives that are obviously the budget that you set and the number of students that you're serving. And that's the challenge we've seen in a lot of communities with declining enrollment. What happens is, we see declining enrollment, but staffing levels remain the same. That drives your property taxes up because your per pupil spending is going up. There are some non-property tax revenues that flow directly into this local school district, predominantly federal money that doesn't get factored into the calculation. And then we're going to talk about here tonight is something known as a CLA, Common Level of Appraisal. And this has a huge impact on the tax rate. Sometimes it has minimal impact, but oftentimes it can have a pretty dramatic impact. That has absolutely nothing to do with education spending. And I cringe when I read editorials in the Rutland Herald, not to pick on a particular newspaper, that talk about the concept of, this is a great system, and and your tax rate is 100%, based on what you're spending in your district. And the simple truth is it's just not true. There is another variable in here known as a CLA. That CLA can have a pretty outsized impact on your tax bill, which is exactly what happened in Londonderry, and we're going to walk through that. So I took a stab over the weekend at trying to put together a diagram of how the system works, and I wanted to put it on one piece of paper. And I thought I had a great diagram, and I sent it to Dave. And Dave knows more. By the way, Dave knows more about how the system works than anybody in the state. There's probably only about a dozen people that really know how the system works. Dave is one of them. And Dave said, "I don't understand it." I said, "Okay, well." Immediate fail. So I went back to the drawing board at Dave's suggestion and redrew it, and this is the best I could come up with. And the way, in concept at the statewide level, the way this financing mechanism works is, we have a state education fund that I highlighted earlier. Collectively brings in about $1.5 billion. There's about 40% of it that's raised through non-residential property tax. So at the start of the legislative session, we set a rate that is uniform across the state. It doesn't matter what town you live in, everybody has the same rate. If you're a second homeowner, business owner, it's one uniform rate. We have the income tax that flows in, some of these other miscellaneous sources. And then we arbitrarily set a rate this year of 99 cents. Next year it's going to be $1. And when you add up all that money, it yields $9,459 for every student in the state across all school districts. Okay? So, no school district that I'm aware of spends $9,459. They all spend more than that. So this is the very bottom floor. And what you can do as a school district, what a school district does, is they look at how much, they look at our budget, they look at the budget, the number of students, and they figure out what their per pupil spending is going to be. And then the local tax rate is increased proportionate to the increase against this base rate. I hope that makes sense. But if it doesn't, don't feel bad, because I'm still confused by the system from time to time. But keep that in mind. It's per pupil spending. That's what drives your residential property tax rate. So as an example here, let's say you set I talked about that base rate of $9,500. If you set your per pupil spending at $15,000, your local rate would go to $1.57 this year, just as an example. So I oftentimes, as I'm sure you all do, right just before town meeting day, I pick up the newspaper and I see these headlines that say school budget like up less than 1%, or school budget declines. And then people get their tax bills and they've gone up, and everybody's like, well, hold on a second, what happened? Or remember what I said before, the budget has absolutely no impact. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's one of the variables. It's just one of multiple variables. You have to look at the per pupil spending. So I'll just walk through a quick example of how this works. So I picked on one last year that went up 0.6%, so less than 1%. But what the headline doesn't tell you is that the pupil count in this example went down. And as a result, the per pupil spending went from $16,071 to $18,000, which is an 11% increase. And guess what? Your tax rate goes up by 11%. Okay? So when you're looking at town meeting day or before town meeting day, when you're looking at your school budget, a lot of folks, it's classic Vermont tradition. We go and we look at how much we're spending on pencils and toilet paper, and we have an argument about how we're going to spend $200. This is the page you want to look for in your town report, in your school report. It's a page that looks just like this, and there's a line item here that has your per pupil spending. And this is where you want to look, because this is what's going to drive your tax rate. But wait, there's more. We're not done. So, folks in Londonderry, listen up. This is the key thing, the key driver behind big portion of our property tax bills. So there's this problem we have with the statewide education funding system and a statewide grand list is no grand list is 100% accurate. And if you have a self-contained grand list within a town, it doesn't really matter if property values don't keep pace, or if the listed values don't keep pace with fair market value. It doesn't really matter. You raise the taxes, but everybody's tax bill comes out in the wash. It doesn't work that way when you have a statewide system. You have to, because otherwise one town would end up paying less than another. So you have to equalize so that the tax base, the valuation, in other words, is a true representation of, or close to true representation of fair market value. So basically, you've got to come up with a mechanism to do that. You can do that with more frequent reappraisals. You can do that based on an adjustment of the ratio of listed sales versus actual sales. And that's what we have today. That's called the common level of appraisal. So basically, there's a 3-year rolling average. We look at what properties are listed at in the grand list in that town. We look on a rolling 3-year average. We look at how things are, what they're actually selling for relative to their listed value. And that comes up, that basically spits out what's known as the CLA. And the CLA does not necessarily show up, and I know in several of our towns, it's not presented on the tax bill, so it's invisible. But what happens is we have the CLA that's applied to the tax rate, so it looks like your tax rate's gone through the roof if your CLA's gone down. So let me give you just a quick illustration here of kind of why we have a CLA. And let's just take town A and town B. Let's say there's a assessed value of $100 million of property in the grand list in town A and $50 million in town B. Now these are assessments. This is what the listers have on record. But let's say the true market value is $100 million in town A and $100 million in town B. So in other words, town B is underassessed by 50%. The problem with a statewide education funding system is that, let's, as an example, take $1.50 in town A raises $1.5 million that goes to the state education fund. Town B, it only raises $750. So basically, without any sort of a mechanism to equalize the two, town B would basically get a discount of 50% on their taxes because their listers decided not to keep the listed values up to date with market conditions. In really simple terms, the way to think about the CLA is as property values are increasing relative to listed values, the CLA goes down. If you're a taxpayer, you like it when your CLA goes up. When your CLA goes up, it means that property market value is below listed value and your tax rate is adjusted accordingly. So here's a hypothetical example of how this plays out. So let's say there's property worth $100,000 and the education tax rate was set at 1.599. And the CLA was 97.64%. That 97.64 effectively means that property is listed slightly below market value. So what we could do is we could, on the tax bill, adjust the value of the property and say that while your property may be listed at 102, it's probably worth closer to 102 versus 100 that it's listed for, and keep the tax rate the same. Or we could leave the listed value alone and adjust the tax rate, but they both net out same tax due. This is what we do. This is the impact of the CLA. It adjusts the tax rate, not the value, which creates a lot of confusion when there's a big swing in the CLA. So just to kind of walk through an example in Londonderry, and again, I picked on Londonderry because it's such a, it's an example, it really highlights how dramatic of an impact the CLA can have. So I looked at 10 years of education tax rate and the CLA for the town of Londonderry. And you can see back in 2000, basically when the real estate market was booming, the CLA in 2005 was a little over 80%, and it kept going down every year as the real estate market, kept increasing in value. And you'll see we also, this orange line here, this represents the education tax rate in Londonderry before any adjustment, before the CLA adjustment. And then the blue line represents what it is after the CLA adjustment. So you can see in these years here, we had pretty dramatic increases. We had some pretty big increases in education spending, but we also had dramatic increases in property values, which drove the tax rate way up. Well, basically right around 2009, we had a reappraisal. And when you have a reappraisal, now your listed values are a better reflection of market value. And your CLA is basically reset at 100%. And you can see it's been very stable. Our listers here have pretty much kept the CLA within a 5% margin of error every year. So we've been insulated from some more dramatic changes that other towns often see. But then look what happened between 2014 and 2015. We had a pretty significant drop. So we went from roughly 104.5% down to 97.5%. And that, it's hard to see here, but that's why the blue line went quite a ways up. That's our actual rate as adjusted by the CLA. Let me walk through an example of what if we didn't have a CLA. And this is not realistic, because if you bought a house for $200,000 10 years ago, it's not going to be worth $200,000 today. This isn't real, but just to illustrate that you have to look at it, your education spending and the impact that's having on your tax rate. You also have to look at the underlying valuation basis. And so if we didn't have to worry about valuation basis, if property values never changed, which obviously, again, is not real world, this would show you what the tax rate, or what you would pay in taxes, what it would look like, and the changes over that 10-year period. So, looking at an example of a $200,000 house in Londonderry, last year we had an residential education tax rate of 1.523. This year it was 1.599, 5% increase. CLA went from 104.5 down to 97.5. And you can see, so now our adjusted tax rate went from 1.458 to 1.639. Basically, in 2014 versus 2013, the CLA went up. So we got a little bit of a discount in our taxes, but then it created we ended up with this chasm. So the actual, on a $200,000 house, your actual tax bill went from $29.16 to $32.78. So, put this in percentage terms. You can see again your education tax rate went up 5%. So this is driven purely by spending. The CLA changed by 6.6%. You now have a 12.4% increase in your tax rate. So I'm going to pause there and open up for questions, head scratching. Jim.
So the reason why is the CLA applied to values rather than tax rates?
I have argued for that for years. Personally, I think that that's something that we need to do. I think one of the challenges, to be perfectly honest, one of the challenges in going that direction is that your listers, you wouldn't happen to be one of those, would you? But might start receiving a lot of phone calls. So the question is, why don't we just apply the CLA to the property value on the tax bill rather than have it applied on the tax rate? Because the CLA is really intended to impact the tax base, the valuation that's being taxed, rather than any reflection on local decision making around spending. And the response to that is, personally, I have argued for that in the past. The challenge is that if property values started changing on everybody's tax bill year over year over year, the listers are going to start getting a lot of phone calls. Yes? Tim?
What that means is when somebody from Londonderry complains about what happened to their tax rate, the appropriate response is that they're fortunate that their property values have gone up significantly between 2014 and 15.
If they were able to sell their property and realize that gain.
I'm Donald Cavaselli from Athens. My wife's chairman of the Board of Listers. One thing we'll probably run into in a small town, and I'm sure a lot of small towns in Hamlet's run into the same problem. We have 254 taxable parcels. You can get a sale out of state that's really out of line with the market value, and it can really skew our grand list and our CLA. And we've been saying for years we need a system that where we can group with other towns other similar towns or have some sort of comparables, where we get a little bit more of a break.
That's a great comment, and that speaks to scalability challenges we have, not only with how we handle listings of property value, but also with how we spend money and how we account for it. And quite frankly, that is a direction that Act 46 takes us, is to get us to larger governance units. We're not going to go there just yet under Act 46 as far as how we're managing the CLA, but it certainly opens the door to that. Great question. Yes?
Francesca Salazar from Andover. I'd like to know how the sending towns reflect in the school tax.
When you say sending, are you referring to towns that send more money to the education fund than they actually spend?
Yes.
So there are, in this education funding contract that we have, there are towns that, through this mechanism, let me go back here. Let's see. You had to take it back to the first one, right? Oh, there we go. So there are towns, and there are towns where $15,000, when they set a rate of tax rate of 157, will yield a gazillion dollars, right? A very basic. If they have a large grant list, they're going to generate a lot more money for the state education fund than they actually use. And then there are towns that don't have much of a grant list, and that $15,000, although their tax rate's only $1.50, is still $1.57. It's the same. They're not going to generate the same revenues. In fact, they're going to generate less revenues for the state education fund than they are actually drawing down. And that is a hallmark of Act 60 and 68. And that was the whole concept, was to equalize funding. And I'm not making a statement on the value of that. I happen to not be a fan, I think you all know, of our current funding formula system, but that's the way it works. Yes, Dave, yes.
So I might paint a slightly different picture. Our Constitution requires us to educate all the students in the state of Vermont, not the students in London area or Bristol, but all of our students. And this was reinforced by the Brigham decision, which resulted in Act 60. And what this essentially does is says that the Supreme Court said that we don't have a lot of levers in terms of equalizing and providing equal education across the state, but one of them that we do have is money. So we're going to require the legislature to create a system that provides equalized resources for students across the state. And so what we have now is we have the contributors, the non-property tax rate and other state revenues in that pie chart that Oliver showed earlier contribute a massive amount of money to the education fund that every school draws down. And the residential portion, virtually every town in the state it gets a discount on their ed spending over the base calculation amount. So, and that's paid for by every other community in the state through the calculations of the education fund. So that's a little bit of a convoluted explanation, but the basic answer is that we're responsible for the education of all of our students across the state. So all of the voters and all of the school budgets across the state is reflected in our local tax rates.
Great.
Oliver, I just want to, one thing you didn't mention that I think is really important is that you might want to explain that something like 80% of Vermonters don't pay property taxes based on their property value.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really important point. And so, you know, I've just to keep it simple, and it's really hard to keep a system as complicated as this simple. I haven't gone into income sensitivity, but John's absolutely right. it's 70 or 80% of Vermonters don't actually pay their residential education taxes based on their property value. They're paying based on household income. And the mechanics behind the scenes of how that works are incredibly complicated, but just to make it really simple, or at least as simple as I can make it, is basically what we do is, it's the same basic concept where we take before I talked about how we have this base rate of 99 cents on the property tax, and that base rate yields $9,500, and then as you increase your per pupil spending, that increases your local property tax. Well, if your household earns roughly less than $100,000 a year, your education tax is based on your income, and it's the same principle. There's a base percentage of your household income that will yield that $9,500, and as your local per pupil spending increases, that base percentage increases. It is very convoluted, but that's the simplest way that I can explain it. I have introduced and advocated for a system that would make this a lot more transparent. No change in education finance is easy. I'd like to see us get there one day so that we can better connect taxpayers so they better understand, when I'm voting on this budget, I'm voting on this per pupil spending, this is what I'm going to pay, because it's not very clear today. But in simple terms, thanks for bringing that up, John. Yes?
How much money is left on the table because of income sensitivity? Or if you got rid of it today, you waved your wand and got rid of it, would you just homogenize the tax rate across the board?
It's roughly $158 million a year that the residential property tax is effectively discounted to fund this income tax mechanism.
So if you got rid of income sensitivity, you got $158 million, that 28% that you said was contributed, what would that go to roughly? What sort of contribution would that be to the overall?
Well, you'd have to find a way to replace $158 million, if that makes sense. You basically would have to raise residential property taxes by $158 million.
No, if everybody paid their...
Oh, if everybody paid
then you would have $158 million.
Yeah, it would be
to what you had right now.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the portion of the residential property tax would go up. The percentage would go up because it's effectively subsidized by all the other, funding sources.
You do one of two things: you have an extra $158 million to spend, or it would homogenize the tax rate,
exactly,
and bring it down for everybody.
Well, it wouldn't bring it down for everyone. What it would mean is 2/3 of the people who pay based on their income now would have significantly higher tax bills, and the people who have residential property taxes and or non-residential property tax payers, their rates would go down significantly.
That's exactly my point.
Yes, and I think you'd probably have a huge revolt on your hands. Because it's 2/3 of the residential property taxpayers for the state of Vermont.
You might have one anyways for the other.
I'm familiar with that.
I'm guessing this isn't going to be a central plank of Shap's keep. Any other questions before we move on to Act 46? Oh, sorry, yes, Jim.
I have a question. How much of a local school budget is actually controllable by that school board?
The answer is it varies, and it varies depending on your governance structure. It varies based on whether you're operating your own school, whether you're tuitioning your students. So on one extreme, we have towns that K through 12 do not operate a school. They write a check for every one of their students who attends a neighboring school. They have zero control. Well, I shouldn't say zero. They do have some leverage, but they don't have direct control over those budgets. On the other end of the spectrum, you have K through 12 districts that actually operate schools, and they have a high degree of control over their spending. But as was pointed out earlier, there are certain you know, there's certain special education is one in particular where, you know, there are federal laws that we as a state and as individual school districts have to comply with. We have to provide certain educational opportunities, and you know, that can represent an uncontrollable expense.
The teachers' wages are not negotiated.
They're negotiated.
Across the state.
They're negotiated on a district by district basis. Yep. And staffing levels, that's, you know, that's something that's determined on a district by district level. Yep.
Annie Fuji. I guess in these formulas, what I've never been able to figure out that has not been addressed to me, or the way I've understood, is the fact that in rural communities with a very extreme socioeconomic diversity, it obviously costs so much more per pupil to educate or to provide the same benefits for these, or educational quote-unquote opportunity. I don't see these formulas address that in any way, and I feel that we look like we're rich in numbers, but in pupils, that it's a very complex situation. And I don't see that quote-unquote educational opportunity has been addressed in rural, economically diverse areas.
That's a great.
Can you explain?
Yes.
Some way?
Yes.
Is this considered, or
it is?
How is that factored in any way?
So it's a great point, and I'll tell you that our friends up in Burlington will make the exact same argument, and will say that they have to educate kids who speak 30 different languages, who are refugees from war-torn nations. But to specifically answer your question, when we count students in Vermont, you'll see, if you go back on that page on your annual report that has, you know, this table that's an eye chart, there's something called equalized students or equalized pupils. And in Vermont, a pupil is not a pupil, right? It can't be that simple. They're equalized pupils. And we have ADM, and we have a million different ways of counting kids. But there's actually a method to the madness. It's not perfect, and in my view, there's room for improvement. But what we do, why we call them equalized pupils, for a number of reasons, is we make adjustments. So we say, for example, that a child who is receiving free and reduced lunch counts as more than a pupil, counts as like maybe 1.2 pupils. And the reason that's done is because we know as a state from the data that we have that kids who are, you know, statistically, kids who are on free and reduced lunch typically need more services than the baseline population. So we give those school districts extra credit for serving that particular population. And there are other, you know, there are other sort of weighting factors that go into it as well. Again, it's not perfect, but it is, there is some of this built into the system. It's a great question, and it's a great point. It's a big issue. Dave, did you want to chime in on that?
I just wanted to say, you know, not just school tax rates, but other federal programs are distributed based on applications for free and reduced price lunch. And so it's critically important that schools do the best job they can to enroll students and families in the free and reduced price lunch program, even if I know that there's at least one school in the state that doesn't consider that as a part of delivering lunches to their students. Okay, that's fine, but it does help the taxpayers who are paying for those kids to go to school, and it does help those families qualify for other programs. So it's critically important that schools do a good job of identifying the students that are eligible and having them fill out the paperwork for free and reduced price lunch.
Oliver, Rob Church from Stratton. I'm just wondering, where is the incentive for schools to reduce the number of teachers they have on staff, which comprises 80% of the cost and ultimately gets to the tax rate?
It's you. It's all of you. It's all of us, the voters. We have a voice. How many folks in this room went to their school board, their annual school meeting this year? Okay. You all have a voice. We all have a voice, and that's where it's at. That's where it lives.
I just got to tell you an anecdote. I was at another school district just the other day, talking with the superintendent. And the superintendent said, you know, their I forget the grade, 5th grade numbers were down. So they needed to reduce their staffing levels for 5th grade. So they gave a pink slip to one of the teachers in 5th grade. And there was such community outrage that they would dismiss this beloved individual from the school that they had to actually find a job for her somewhere else in the district. So it's those kinds of, you know, caring for our neighbors and our friends who have jobs in the school that, that keep the spending, that keep those staff members employed in our school system and drive up tax rates. And it's not just in that district I visited, it's in my district, and I would be willing to bet it's in yours too. We need to spend some serious effort at right-sizing our school districts across the state. And it's another reason why we believe that going to a larger 900 students or more integrated pre-K through 12 school district will help this effort to right-size our school districts.
And again, I go back to my earlier example. I mean, you know, from that slide from the AOE, this isn't an exercise that requires handing out pink slips. This, you know, we have built-in year-over-year attrition in the school system with retirements, et cetera. And we're having great difficulty with a large number, you know, the 300+ school districts we have, managing that attrition in a smart way that actually right-sizes the ship to, you know, correspond with the declining enrollment that we've seen.
Could you, Kathy, could you tell me what reason why we have declining enrollment? I mean, we're downstate basically, less people living here, people with young people, children are moving out, am I correct? So have you addressed how to maybe make the state grow again and maybe get the economy going? I mean, these are all factors I think will factor in on this, but you know, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of factors, and Vermont's not alone. I mean, this is a national phenomenon, and that rural states across the country face. And for a variety of, you know, a variety of social factors at play that have, you know, basically resulted in, you know, younger generations of folks moving out of rural areas, moving into more metropolitan areas, and we're not immune. You know, there's a lot we're working on as a state. You know, southern Vermont is particularly hard hit. You know, there's a task force that was established this year, thanks to, you know, I really have to thank Shap Smith for this, because it wouldn't have happened without his support, establishing a Southern Vermont economic zone. And you know, we've you know, basically established a committee, a task force that's looking at ways that we can generate more economic activity and attract more people to move to the state. But that's not going to happen overnight. You know, this is a generational shift that we've seen. This has happened over 20 years. We're not going to turn the ship overnight. But John.
I just want to quickly, I think that some of what you're saying is perpetuating a rumor that we're trying really, really hard to fight here, is that our student enrollment numbers here in Londonderry, our district, are not shrinking. We've actually added students every year for about 4 years now. So our students to teacher numbers are actually getting higher, and we've been adding students. So we're atypical in the state in that regard.
We are very atypical. Bruce. Oh, Jim, I'm sorry.
Yeah, when you talk about attrition being a method to reduce the number of teachers, you know, it gets a little bit more complicated than that in a school situation with teachers. You have to have the right teachers being, you know, subject to attrition to, you know, the one that you already wanted to eliminate that position. You know, it's a little bit more complicated than just accepting attrition as a way to reduce the number of students. No.
No, I agree. That's tough. Okay, guys, we are Frank.
So just a quick comment on that, just because it's such a central issue. Some easy math numbers around cost per student, and by the way, all of this is really impressive how you're taking so much complexity and simplifying it. And,
I don't know if I simplified it.
This really is the simple version.
By the way, Frank is the business manager for the Windsor Southeast Supervisor.
Yeah. Wyndham Southeast down the Bradboro system. Really quick, easy math, 140 kids, 7 grades, right? That's 20 kids per grade. right? That's a typical Vermont elementary school. We got K through 6, that's our 7th grades. So boards have been putting budgets together, let's say, at that level for years. And then as Oliver said, across the state, the typical example is we're going all the way down to 105 kids. That's a 25% decline. And the easy math there is going from 20 kids per grade to 15 per grade, right? So 7 times 15 is 105. So the point is in a system, in a statewide system where everything is cost per student, is the school board going to lay off a teacher where you used to have a teacher, 140 students, 1 per grade level, right? So 7 teachers, 20 kids at each grade level, 140. If we go all the way down to 15 kids per grade level, 7 times 15 is 105. Are we going to lay off our teacher in any of those grade levels? And the answer is probably not, because a 15 student-teacher ratio in the classroom is still a reasonable ratio. So there's the illustration. There's the point that our resident from Stratton raised. Where's the impetus? Well, it certainly isn't there, and that is the 25% that Oliver, has illustrated that has occurred in Vermont in the last, 10, 15 years. If we keep going below the 15 and we get down toward, 90 and 70, and many of you folks are from communities that do have 70 kids in the classroom, in the schoolhouse. And I'm from the area where we have a school with 20. So, when we get down to that level, you can see if it's a cost per student model, the tax rates are going through the roof because you still need to run the basic program. So there's a little bit more context.
Yep.
I want to, on this gentleman's example here, the state has also mandated so many instructional hours per subject per grade level, so it's not always as easy as laying off a teacher. I'm on a high school board where we were doing a career program voluntarily. Now it's state mandated. This splits our student populations. We have a technical school in a different location. They're coming back. We're having to repeat classes. And because of that, our classes are split. Nothing is simple.
No, trust me, there's no disagreement from I don't think any legislator here. By the way, Senator Rebecca Ballin, she just came in before. I wanted to make sure. She represents Windham County, Jamaica, and Stratton.
Before we
yes,
I have one other illustration. So I represent Worcester, which is in Washington County. It's right next to Middlesex, and their schools are about 10 miles apart. This past year, but they're separate school districts. This past year, Worcester had 6 kids in its kindergarten class, and Middlesex had 20. Actually, it may have been more. It may have been 24. So they're in a position where Middlesex has to hire, really, for it to be right, 2 teachers, where if we had had one district, they could have actually shared the resources, and they're 10 miles apart. Right? The schools are really within busing distance, and it was a challenge. Because they are in the same supervisory union, but they're different school boards making different decisions. That's not going to be perfect, and those are really difficult discussions. But that illustrates some of the reason that we started having conversations about Act 46.
One last question, then we're going to start talking about Act 46.
My name is Dan Armando.
Yes.
From Dummerston. I'm really glad you brought up that point because I'm so confused about why, if there's anything statutorily or any regulations that prohibit those 2 schools from working together anyways. It seems to me that the state is saying you have to combine governance structures in order for this to happen. I don't know why schools can't work together anyways.
It's a complicated answer. It varies depending on where you are. I mean, there are some places where the school district, because it will impact the tax rates of Middlesex in a different way than it'll impacting for Worcester. I mean, the fact that you've got two distinct regional entities or school districts with different tax rates, different budgets, it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to work together because they have different interests.
I mean, wouldn't you suppose the state could trust two school boards to talk to each other and work it out amongst themselves?
Sometimes they do.
Yeah, I don't understand how. Well, then how can you disagree with what he's saying? I mean, wouldn't it be easier to simply allow the schools to work together and let them work that out themselves than?
So I think, first of all, it's extraordinarily difficult within the statutes to move students from one school district to another school district. That's like either going to choice or I'd be willing to bet that you'd have to change a statute somehow to permit that to happen.
I'll vote for that.
But secondly, though, I'd like to. It's a perfect segue to Act 46. It really is. We have one supervisory union in the state that has moved forward and done this, even before Act 46 was passed, and that's the Chittenden East Supervisory Union. And one of the architects of that is right here, Andrew Pond. I want to recognize him. You should all corner him later and ask him how it's going in his district. But he was in the Bolton School Board. And Bolton was a small school that was very much threatened to have to close, because financially the community could no longer support the school, the tiny school in its community. Because of the formation of this larger school district within which Bolton School existed, they were able to do exactly what you're talking about. So they invited some families, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, some families from Jericho to move their students to the Bolton kindergarten, so that they were able to have 2 teachers instead of 3 kindergarten teachers in that school district. Once you have the larger school district, then all these things become much easier and much easier and much better for kids, to give kids the appropriate kind of education and the right student-teacher ratio without necessarily hiring additional people.
So if I could just pause before, we're going to talk about Act 46 and governance. So if you have questions about consolidation, governance, transitions, et cetera, if you could just hold those, we'll go through that, and but if you have, before we move on, are there any final questions on sort of funding issues? Or how did that explanation before with some of the eye charts I threw up there, did any of that help at all?
Yes, very much.
Okay, good. Okay, at least some mission accomplished there. All right. All right. Well, so let's talk about where we go from here and what Act 46 is all about. And so I think a good place to start is goals. And actually, Dave, would you mind speaking to the goals, or do you want me to cover?
Sure.
This is.
So I think you have them up there. The goals, the 3 basic goals are for equity, to move towards better educational opportunities for students throughout the state. Quality, to have better quality education for students, and to do it in a way that taxpayers can afford over the long run, we call sustainability. One of the really dramatic examples of that is I was speaking with the president of UVM the other day, and he learned that one of the Golden Green students, so every valedictorian of every high school in the state can go to UVM free. That's a big a bonus. 70,000, 100,000, I don't know what it is or what it's going to be. But there was a valedictorian in the state that was not attending UVM. And he was appalled, upset. Why is this happening? So it turns out that this student was not eligible to attend UVM because their school was not able to deliver the kind of curriculum to make that student eligible to be accepted into UVM. So that's an example of where we fall short in some of our schools in the state. And we need to do a much better job in creating educational opportunity for students across the state.
Yes?
It seems to me in that situation, I mean, we're throwing money. We have equalization, of money throughout the state. So who's where do we have any quality control? To your point, I mean, this person couldn't go because the standards weren't. But we've been throwing money to make every educational since Act 60 and 68 equal. So why isn't that happening? I mean, when you say something like that, I'm appalled. I've been spending zillions of dollars on my educational tax, and that's not happening. And why? And where are the controls, and why hasn't it happened?
So the speaker recognized that problem and convened a summer study group and invited suggestions from, pardon?
Repeat the question, please.
So why is this, she's paying property taxes higher than she wants to be paying, and we're not getting the results that we ought to be getting. Where is the control? Where is the change coming from? And so the speaker convened a summer study committee, and he invited people from across the state to make suggestions. Nearly 100 suggestions came in, all the way from one school district for the entire state to a fixed amount of money that was the adequate amount of money that every child should be given in the state. And we started from that basis in our discussion about where to move. And for generations, hundreds of years, Vermont has vested this quality control and this tax rate and financing of education with local districts and local communities. So how much were we willing to move away from that in the legislature? Were we willing to say, okay, we're going to have one school district for the entire state, and we're going to make the decisions at the state level, in the state school board or with the Agency of Education about what students get what coursework and what teachers were going to go to what school? We didn't go there. We left as much local control in this Act 46 as we possibly could. What we did say was that we want to see pre-K through 12 integrated school districts of at least 900 students. And if we get to that level, we can begin to have more educational opportunity, looking at equity, opportunity, and sustainability for our students across the state. And this is an incredibly difficult conversation because we have such a variety of school districts now. We have a bunch of communities that are choice K through 12. We have other communities that operate schools K through 12. We have supervisory unions that look like somebody was out of their mind some night and just drew these crazy lines in the state about where school districts were going to be in a supervisory union. And so what we're doing, what the legislature ended up doing, was asking school boards in communities across the state to get together to figure out what is the better answer for opportunities for their students in their region, and figure out ways to come together in these larger integrated school districts. That's the essence of Act 46, and that's what we're asking citizens across the state. We left as much local control in the state of Vermont as we felt we could.
So I'm just going to ask if everybody can just hold their questions. We'll get through this, and then we'll have questions. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions on Act 46, and I just at least want to get through the high-level overview. So let's talk about the major components of Act 46. So the first is, I think as everybody knows, one major component, arguably the largest component of Act 46, is basically a program that's going to result in the merger, the convergence of school districts and supervisory unions across the state. So the goal is, Dave pointed out, is to create larger governance units and move away from a model where it's one district, one board plus an SU on top of it to one where there's a district that looks after a larger population of students. There's a couple of different ways to approach that, which we'll get into. And it's basically there's the early phases of this transition are going to basically encourage voluntary mergers across districts, and there are a number of incentives to accomplish that. At the end of the day, though, we can't be left with orphan districts out there, and at some point, Secretary of Education, working in conjunction with the State Board of Education, will look at basically putting together a plan for what to do with the remaining districts that choose not to go the voluntary route initially. So, you know, another challenge we have with our current financing system is, on one hand, we're saying we want to have a sustainable system, but we actually have a lot of incentives in place today with our current mechanism that actually encourages the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish with Act 46. So, you know, for example, people may have heard about phantom students. Well, what are phantom students? We have about 2,000 of them in Vermont. And basically, it's a provision, if you go back to, you know, my earlier point about the importance of per pupil spending, we have a provision in law that basically is, you know, it's a hold harmless. It basically says, if you lose students, you can pretend that you really didn't lose students for a few years. So your per pupil spending is artificially suspended at a lower level than it truly is, and your tax rate is artificially held below what it truly is. So therefore, there's no real incentive to change until until you're way down the track. So, you know, the phantom students, that's being readjusted so that there's more of an incentive to address declining enrollment in these schools. The other issue is we're changing the small school grants. So right now, if you're a small school, you are awarded a grant that artificially lowers your per pupil spending. So you don't, it's not, your per pupil spending is not a true reflection of what your per pupil spending is. That's going to convert into a merger support grant. So another sort of incentive to move folks along the line with this merger process. And you know, I think some of these, just to illustrate the impact of some of these incentives that exist that are going to be phased out under Act 46. And as I mentioned, the challenge is it creates this false economy. And there's, you know, folks, they start making comparisons and they say, well, our school is really, you know, it's a low cost per student operation because they're using the per pupil expenditure number and they're comparing it with a school district that doesn't receive those supports, and it creates this false economy. And you know, just as an example, last year, I'll give you two Town A and Town B, we'll call them. Town A has had 16 pupils. They drew down from the Ed Fund $335,000 to run that school. The actual expenditure on a per pupil basis that was drawn from the Ed Fund was close to $21,000. But because of the small school grant, phantom students, all the rest of this kind of stuff, what shows up on the tax bill that's used to calculate the tax rate is a per pupil spending number of $15,000. So the voters in the community are completely isolated from the reality of what it's costing to run this particular school. Now contrast that with school district B, with 31 students, drawing down just shy of $500,000 from the education fund. The cost from the education fund, $15,500. But what shows up is used to calculate the tax bill. It's $15,630, just slightly over, about just $500 more than Town A. So as a consequence, Town B pays more in taxes than Town A, even though it's saving the education fund money. These guys are basically tuitioning their students, they're sending their students out to fill empty desks at surrounding schools at no additional cost. So, you know, this is some of the, you know, the false economy that we have in the existing system. We're transitioning away with Act 46. We're going to, you know, have a much clearer picture by starting to roll back some of these supports. The final major component of Act 46 is a cost containment component. And basically what this will do for 2 years, it's an interim measure, it's going to replace the current excess spending penalty with a threshold penalty that's going to be based on spending growth. And this is a key difference because the excess spending penalty, the way it works is we look at average per pupil spending across the state, and we establish a ceiling. We say 123%. If you spend more than 123% of the statewide average, you pay a penalty. There were discussions up until the very end in the conference committee between the House and the Senate about, as a cost containment measure, to lower that number down dramatically. The challenge in doing so is that it would have brought basically districts today, based on their current spending levels, without any increase in spending, just holding their current spending or even making a slight reduction, would all be paying a penalty. And it did not bring in a lot of the bigger, the folks who are, have large operations that are actually driving a lot of education spending. So that concept was shifted away from that concept and moved to the concept of going after the growth rate in spending. And by doing so, every school district is treated fairly, and everybody's into this cost containment mechanism. Now there's variability from district to district, and that threshold, that's a percentage that you can increase your spending by, is set based on your current per pupil spending. So if you are a high spender on a per pupil basis relative to your peers in the state, you are allowed less room to grow before you hit that penalty box. If you're a low spender on a per pupil basis, you're allowed to grow your spending by a greater percentage before you hit the penalty box. But and this is an interim measure, it replaces temporarily the current excess spending penalty with this mechanism. And really, the concept here is, we have a system that continues to grow. We have a tax base, as illustrated earlier, that is under serious stress right now. And as we work through this transition under Act 46 to larger governance units, we needed some interim cost relief because the system, as it's going and the trajectory that it's on, is just not sustainable. So I know I get this question a lot. I think Dave may get it more than I do. So why merge districts? What's the value in this? And I look at this from two perspectives, and there's certainly a cost element to this, but there's, I think, arguably the more important point is this is about educational opportunity for our kids. And I look around and across the state, and I've been in a lot of schools around, certainly around this area, and also in other parts of the state. And we have some real, despite the fact that we equalize funding, we have some real disparity in the quality of education that kids are receiving. And when you look at one district, and you look at, look at Floodbrook and look at everything Floodbrook is able to offer its students with 272 kids. Floodbrook was founded, I should have mentioned earlier, founded in 1965. 4 towns got together, and my understanding was the first K through 8, 62?
Two towns got together.
Oh, 2 towns got together, and then another one came on, and then, but my understanding was the first K through 8 union elementary school in the state. It's first read in the state. And, if you look at the programs that Floodbrook is able to offer at the cost per student, if you were to break out Floodbrook into 4 separate schools, I can assure you there's no way you would be able to offer the wonderful programs that are available here at Floodbrook in 4 separate schools still. There's just absolutely no way. So but we're not talking about consolidating schools necessarily, just talking about consolidating governance units. So let's walk through kind of what the model looks like today. And I'll just throw three school districts up as an example. This is a very simplified example. Let's call them the green town, blue town, and red town. It's a fairly typical model. We have a school board that operates a school. We have staffed by a number of educators and serves a number of students. And they're all more or less, they're doing some very similar things. So the challenge we're seeing, let's say the Greentown here is, you know, we have a teacher who retires. We have a few students that transition out of the system, and there aren't new students that come back into the system. So now the school board has this dilemma, and the dilemma is, basically, we can replace the teacher, but we still don't have the same number of students. We still have this problem, we don't have a lot of students. So if we do so, we're basically going to increase our cost per student, and therefore our tax rate. Or we can eliminate the program, and our tax rate, you know, more or less doesn't change at all. And this is a dilemma that all three of these school districts are going through. You know, it's maybe slightly different staff, but they're all seeing declines in enrollment. So, you know, and the issue is these are shared challenges, but they're each individually trying to work to address these challenges. And, you know, I think it was brought up before, why don't the school boards just get together? You know, if I've had a few examples over recent history where, you know, just the simple logistics of trying to organize a meeting with different school boards and getting it properly warned is an undertaking in of itself. It's not as easy as it might sound. So the concept here is, you know, as we move to under X46, an expanded board model or governance model, is we basically have one board that now looks after, you know, in this example, 3 schools. So now this board that has this broader perspective that's looking after all 3 schools, saying, okay, in the Greentown, we had this teacher retire, and this one went somewhere else, and this one retired, and we're losing students across the board. Now you can very efficiently, because you're one board, very efficiently start having conversations about, okay, well, what if we shared this teacher, you know, over here, or move this one over here? If we consolidated some grades, I'll pick one example. Let's say you have 3 K through 8 schools. Maybe you decide that you're going to turn the blue one in here into a junior high school, and these 2 are going to be elementary schools. The sky's the limit. There's all sorts of things you can do now that you're operating under one board that has this unified perspective. You can also start moving students around more easily between the schools. So the point is, you know, the object here is to move to a scalable and sustainable educational ecosystem. We need to, as a state, Dave, I'm going to steal this one from Dave. We need to take, you know, the adults out of the room and put the kids back in the room, and we need to start thinking about the opportunities that we're offering these kids. And, you know, we tend to think about these things, you know, in historic terms. You know, hey, I went to school here, and this is the way it was, and I want the school to continue to be exactly the way it was when I went there as a kid. And, you know, we need to take a step back and recognize that a lot has changed, and both in how we educate our students and the challenges we're facing as a state. And think about how we can offer increased opportunities for our students at a cost we can afford. So, I think one thing is, you know, people get hung up, and I always remind as I speak with school board members, people get hung up on, well, what can't we do under Act 46? And I respond back and say, think about what you can do. Think about this as a blank canvas. This is an opportunity. Figure out if you could, you know, think about how you would redraw your educational system. What would it look like? And then figure out how to make that work within Act 46. And if it doesn't work, what are the obstacles? And come talk to me. I'll talk to Dave. Call Dave directly. Well, talk to me first, but Dave, I'm sure gets enough phone calls now. And let's figure out how we improve this. This law is huge. It's sweeping. It is not perfect. We all, as legislators, recognize that. The important thing is, you know, we've identified where there are roadblocks. There will be roadblocks. There will be problems. And I'm glad we have both Dave and Shap here. And I think, you know, they're not going to commit to solving every problem, but I think there's a commitment to working to try to find a path forward to meet the goals of this mission here. So a few things. Act 46 is really, it provides a catalyst, it provides incentives, but local communities drive the change, and I can't emphasize that enough. Get out in front of this, control, we as local communities, we need to control our own destiny. Don't just take a step back and wait for somebody, some bureaucrat in Montpelier what to do. First of all, they're not going to tell you what to do. You need to really dictate how you want this process to unfold. There's lots of flexibility, lots of different options, and the key thing is it ultimately comes down to who your dance partners are, who you go out and work with, and the agreements that you come to as individual boards and towns as far as how what your vision is, how you want the new structure to work. I think one point I really want to make, I think is, I know is very important to members of this community, is that Act 46 does not undermine school choice in any way. And I just want to make that absolutely clear. Is there anybody in this audience that would like to get rid of school choice? Didn't think so. Not one hand.
No, actually, Dave says that he'd like to give the kids opportunity. I think everybody in this room would agree that is giving kids opportunity. Incredible high school burden, which is school choice. And one of my questions that you might have just answered is, what happens to school choice in Act 46 as it relates to what's the state's, what's the overall wisdom right now? What direction? I noticed in your slides they were very traditional that they didn't provide for any school choice. The way they were organized. So.
Act 46 provides the opportunity, it's a local choice. So Act 46 provides an opportunity to curtail choice if local communities decide they want to do that. I don't think anybody here wants to do that. You can also expand it, right? So in fact, there are conversations going on in at least one SU that I know of that they're actively talking about how they can expand school choice. So.
Oliver?
Yes?
Can you say fairly on that, though, that it's probably going to limit major way your dance partners, as you call them?
It could, and I think there are...
Somebody's going to have to make some big internal changes before they can dance together.
Potentially, and there's some little wrinkles that I'm going to be looking to iron out. So basically, there's lots of different variations, but there's a few different, very high level kind of scenarios that I see pointing out. One is supervisory union and all of its constituent school districts get together and merge into what's known as a supervisory district. So you've eliminated the supervisory union, you've merged all of these boards, and it's one sort of cohesive unit. And there are districts in Vermont that are they're on the path, they're going down this path. The other path is you move forward, you consolidate, merge individual school districts into a smaller number of districts, but you're still within the same SU. And there are variations of the theme, but those are the two basic sort of approaches. Timeline, there's effectively four phases. I've got three up here. So phase one is the preferred model. This is where you move to a supervisory district. You get the most generous tax incentives. You've got to have this guy up and running by next July. Phase two is more along the lines of having a supervisory union with a smaller number of school districts. If you can get that up and running by 2019, you got 4 years worth of tax incentives. And then phase three is if you basically move to the supervisory district model, but you do so later than 2016, you've got some incentives there as well. What I'd like to do now before we go into Q&A is Dan French. I'd love Dan to just come up and just to put this into context. You can stay there if you want.
Whatever you like.
Why don't you come up here? Okay. And just, if you could, Dan, just take a few minutes and tell us what's going on in the BRSU.
Good evening. It's been a great job.
Thanks.
I'm Dan French. I'm the superintendent of Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union, which is Sunderland, Manchester, Dorset, Pollock, Rupert, Danby, Mount Tabor, Landgrove, Weston, Peru, Londonderry, and Whitehall. We have 11 school districts, fairly complex organization from an Act 46 standpoint. So we knew immediately once the law was passed we were not going to be one of those districts you read about in the paper that's going very quickly through this law. We also have about 54 school board members who are very dedicated to their districts and are very interested in studying this law and understanding its implications to their communities. And that's indeed what we've been doing over the course of the summer. So we've sort of taken advantage of the summer to spend time internally in our organization studying Act 46, so the board members in particular become very fluent in how it might apply to our communities. We're just now, pretty much this week, transitioning to starting to apply the law a bit and start planning for some extensive community engagement processes. There are some, as Oliver said, there are some time limits in the law if any of our districts decide to go after any of the incentives. If not, we have a little more time, but it could be conceivable that some of our districts might be interested in trying to pursue incentives that would require voter action this coming spring. So our boards are, I would say, I'm very pleased with their fluency with Act 46. We've come a long way in understanding it over the summer. We acknowledge we have a very complex organization, but we are getting prepared to move forward quickly and seek out your input in case there is an opportunity for some incentives among our districts.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. How many students are in the district?
2,200. We have about 1,200 are in our schools. We don't operate our high school. So we have about 1,200 in our 6 schools, and then we have another 1,000 or so that are tuitioned out of the district.
Dan, where is your model deficient? It sounds like you could meet the law with your current structure. What do you have to gain by making a change?
Yeah, well, it's almost 2 different questions, I think, because one is, we have this idea of dance partners. It hinges on this definition of what your enrollment is in a district. So we have many different enrollment options in our district, and we have some that are only found here. For instance, we have designated New York high schools. We have districts that don't operate any schools at all. So we have all of that in one organization, so it's kind of challenging to line them up. But the question of what we could get more out of is a big question, and we, as sprawling, I think, from my perspective, our organization is, we've done many things to achieve efficiencies and to really leverage working together, and we're quite proud of that. So it's an open question for our boards, I think, still about what are those positive things that could be gained for further consolidation. But it is a complex piece of work for our districts because we have so many different enrollment options among our 11 districts.
Oliver, does Act 46 allow for the formation and consolidation of supervisory unions, much as was done with BRSU and Two Rivers, Windsor Southwest?
Yeah, and I'll let Dave chime in here, but not explicitly, but only because you can already do that today. I think very much in the way that the formation of the Mountain Town Red paved the way for consolidation of 2 SUs. I think that there are going to be examples where that happens under Act 46.
So the first example is the Act 46 school district that will first vote this November, election day this November, is the Chittenden Central Supervisory Union, aka Essex Junction, and Essex Town. So Essex Junction incorporates both the junction and Westford, and Essex Town is just Essex Town. Each of those have a superintendent, and they're going to vote in November whether to put those 2 together, have 1 superintendent, and the schools in Essex Town, Essex Junction, and Westford will all be part of the same school district. This is an interesting vote not only because it combines 2 superintendencies, and they've projected savings of $1 million in the first year. Also, it's interesting because I believe that, and I said this during the discussions around Act 46, that with regard to choice, and the question about choice earlier is, I think some communities will relinquish choice. And I think other communities will grant choice that don't grant choice now. And we have we have an example of the latter up north. I want to say Concord, but I
thought it was Franklin Northeast. Franklin Northeast.
Concord, I think it is, voted to close their high school and tuition all their students. And Westford is, if they pass this proposal that's been approved by the State Board of Education and will be on the November ballot, Westford will relinquish choice. They will grandfather the students who are now tuitioned out. In Westford, about 95% of their students all go to Essex High School anyway. So this is, you know, a really tiny change for the community of Westford in terms of students. It's a big change in terms of philosophy, whether you're going to grant choice or not. So this is an interesting test of what the implications of Act 46 might be. The tax rates will be significant, tax savings will be significant, not only because they'll be eligible for the accelerated tax incentives, but also because they expect large savings. When you reduce a superintendent's office, that's a big number. So it'll be an interesting process, the first vote in the state.
So can I just say, I think there may be two. The town that I grew up in, Elmore, is talking about merging as part of a supervisory union with Morrisville, where People's Academy is also thinking about merging into the Morrisville district. And again, Elmore, where I grew up, we had choice. And they're deciding whether they're going to eliminate choice. And so that'll be, I've been attending a bunch of the meetings there, and that's a difficult conversation. I'd like to just say one thing. Nobody in their right mind, thinking that there are political advantages, would have actually said, I want to go forward with Act 46 for political reasons. You know, I think that we are grappling with this issue because it's real. It's a struggle that we're having throughout the state, not because we see in it any sort of political opportunity. In fact, I can tell you that people who advise me on politics said stay away from it as much as possible. And I say that sort of jokingly, but I say it because I understand, as somebody who grew up in Elmore, went to school in Morrisville, and who has 2 kids in Morrisville now, how dicey touching local schools or local communities is, and how difficult on an emotional level, just sort of in your gut, it is. And so I just want to say that, because I know some people have suggested that we're doing this for some sort of political advantage, and we're really bad politicians if that's what we're doing.
And if I could just chime in and echo what Shap just said. I mean, this is very much, you know, thankfully was really a nonpartisan issue as it moved through the legislature. There is certainly a variety of opinion. There are legislators who are adamantly opposed to, you know, to this law. It is not easy, and it's certainly politically not easy. But I think, you know, the leaders up in the State House, you know, as leaders, we recognize that the status quo is just, you know, was no longer sustainable, and we had to address the structural challenge and put us on a path forward that ensured, you know, at least holding the opportunities that we have today, if not improving them, but doing so in a way that was sensitive to the challenges we're facing with our tax base. So questions, I'll open up questions on Act 46. Tim?
How hard is the 900 or 900 plus? And in the case of a couple of districts that have choice, parallel choice, let's say, what might be the chances of geographic flexibility rather than proximity?
So there's a lot of flexibility. In fact, you could actually, Dave, keep me honest here. By the way, I don't serve on the education committee, so So there's some of the, when we get really in the weeds, I need to phone a friend here. But there's actually a lot of flexibility with merging, and you don't even have to be contiguous in some cases. Do I have that right, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so actually one of the suggestions was there should be 3 districts that in the state that offer K through 12 choice, because they're kind of clumped in this part of the state, in the Northeast, and I think sort of in the central part of the state. There's kind of, if you look at the map, there's sort of 3 kind of groupings. And so there was one suggestion, we should just have 1 school district. I mean, if you tuition all your kids, you have no control over the tax rate. All you do is write a check, and the school board serves essentially no function. So why don't we just have 1 school board, if you will, or have the state school board be the school board for all the towns that tuition all their students. We didn't go there. We said, you know, communities can figure this out, but there's no geographic requirement that you have to be abutting towns or anything like that.
Good question. Yes.
So will schools be going on the market and busing come into this?
No, this Act 46 does not touch the subject of physical school consolidation. This is purely about governance consolidation. But I think the reality is, as you create larger governance units, and now you have one board that's looking after multiple schools. I go back to the example where maybe there's one board that looks after 3 schools, and they decide that, you know what, we've had some declining enrollments, teachers moving around. Why don't we create a better middle school and consolidate our middle school into 1 building and move all the elementary kids in the other 2? I mean, that's just an example. There's lots of different things that I see playing out over time once you have larger districts with boards that are looking after more than just 1 school. Good question. Annie?
Again, I don't see a whole lot of emphasis on consolidating supervisory unions, where I feel there's more in the local school districts, and there's a lot more to be gained from more of a top-down administrative consolidate supervisory unions. With 900,000 students, do we need more than 10 supervisory unions with the increased, that's maximum, I think, with increased federal and state guidelines? I see that as a major middle consumer of finances that's taking away from the local boards, the districts, and the students. And I'd like more consideration to be done of the consolidating supervisory units.
So let me touch on that briefly. So I hear this a lot, and Act 46 will actually enable some consolidation, probably not as much as anybody would like, of supervisory unions. But to put this in a perspective, there was a proposal a few years ago to consolidate the 60-plus supervisory unions down to 16. And I think the estimated cost savings was like $70 million on a $1.5 billion system. So the potential savings are a lot smaller than folks think they may be. But here's where the potential savings are. Is I think there's room, and I've heard this from business managers, I know Dave has as well, there's a lot of administration overhead associated with managing multiple boards. So if you speak with a business manager, and I think Frank, you're back there, you can probably speak to this better than anybody. I spoke with one business manager who told me that if we were to consolidate or merge these boards, he'd be able to basically get rid of some of his staff in the supervisory office, because a lot of what they're doing is managing all the finances for these individual boards. Frank, do you have a different take on that?
Well, I would just say in general, the supervisory union expense for administration might be 2% of the whole budget. So Dan, I assume that's within your experience as well. So if you can save a lot of money on 2% of the budget, you know you're not going to have a big impact on taxes, right? So I'm not countering your point, Oliver, I'm just saying that as we talked about tonight, money, it's all in the salary and benefits of teachers. As Oliver started at the beginning of the presentation, when we have a student teacher or a staff student ratio, of 4 or 5 compared student, that's where your money is. It's not in your accountants or your bookkeepers or your superintendent. It's in the ability as a single employer to be able to address what Oliver's saying, which is efficiency in employment. A gentleman over here was saying, well, why don't you just do it? Well, imagine having 2 different unions, 2 different pay scales. You talk to any vendor that does business with Vermont schools, and they'll say, well, why don't you give me a call again once you figure out how we can work out a building system or something. You know, those are just somewhat facetious examples, but the real opportunity is in a fuller utilization of our teacher, our paraeducators, our school buses, our buildings, and so on, as opposed to the 2% in the back office.
But there's still savings, and as we saw with this red here, I mean, we eliminated the supervisory union after this, as a result of this red here being formed. Other questions? Yes.
So going back to the taxes, the middle part of your presentation, my tax bill has increased by 25% since 2011. And so I came tonight hoping to get a sense of like how I can have some control over that, because I simply can't afford to have it continue to grow like that. So from what I've heard from you tonight, the only control we have right now is voting on the school budget and voting on our legislators who make decisions. But I mean, is there any, because we don't have any control over the CLA, correct?
Correct.
And is there any other, as an individual taxpayer voter, is there any other recourse besides voting on school budgets?
It's not only just voting, but it's having conversations with, and as I go out and I speak with folks in the community, and somebody is upset with their property tax bill, a lot of folks I find aren't participating in the process, and we all have an opportunity to influence that process. And I would suggest it's more than just going and voting yes or no on the budget. It's I spoke with an unnamed member of a school board recently. He said, I haven't heard any complaints about property taxes. I'm like, there's one or two happy right now. But you know why? Because folks aren't calling them, and they need that feedback. They need to know that, hey, we're maxed out. We need to, they're looking for that feedback. They really are, and I can. From all the school board members I've spoken with in our area, they want to hear from their constituents. Yes, Rob.
Well, Oliver, I have been to the school, to the town meeting day several times in the past, and the last couple of years I couldn't go. But I didn't feel like I missed much, because when I did go, the people who were there were people who could show up on a Tuesday afternoon and were motivated to be there for the reason of approving a budget in a tuition town over which you have very little control in the first place. There wasn't anything meaningful that we could vote out of the budget that had been proposed. So I don't feel like I had any say as a voter in that process whatsoever. I don't think there could have been much of a say with conversations with everyone who has a child, everyone who doesn't like their tax bill. It just seemed pointless to even be there.
Well, you're absolutely, the challenge you're describing is one, you live in a Stratton K through 12 tuition town, so you don't have direct control of those expenditures because they're effectively tuition checks that are being written. But you do have a voice, and people, there are members of our communities who serve on the independent schools as well as the public school boards that serve these towns, and this is important feedback, and we certainly hear it. And I know I serve on the board of trustees at Burton, and this is the kind of feedback that I take back to my colleagues on the board. So I'm going to come right back to you. I just want to get to hands I have not gotten to before. So Robin, why don't I go with you, and then Bruce, and then somebody else.
Why don't you respond to parts of your question? And you actually, to go back to what Oliver was saying about the CLA, which is vital for your tax rate, and you do have influence there with your select board and your listers. So it's not your school board or your legislators, but it's, you know, in your town, staying on top of a town being appraised at market level. One of the towns I represent, the CLA dropped 20% this year, and they panicked. I was getting calls saying, "What happened to our tax rate?" I say, "Talk to your listers, talk to your select board," and that's what you can do as president. Giving you a little bit more.
We got a couple listers shaking their head. but Bruce.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question. I was sort of originally thinking, from what I've heard the last week or two, the idea is down the line it could be that Floodbrook, Dorset, and Manchester might combine into a single school district. It's like, well, it seems sort of silly. But then all night, since we talked about opportunity, I've been thinking about that. And it seems like there is opportunity there for our students, either moving teachers around or students around. So if somebody from Floodbrook wants to do choir, maybe you have an opportunity here, but there is in Manchester. Or the choir teacher could come here. Or the same thing with art or foreign language. It seems like it could really expand the opportunities for our kids if we go through this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. Dwayne. Oh, sorry.
I think we should talk about the lack of connection between the local budget and your tax rates. I think you've been touching on it, but I just want to bring up one year being on the school board, and we had a very active school board member that was adamant we were going to trim the budget at Floodbrook. We cut areas, reduced the budget by 2%. Doesn't seem like a lot, but that's what we could do that year. That board member was absolutely livid when he got his tax bill, and his tax bill had gone up 5%. There's no connection between the two. So I hope we're not giving the public a false sense of hope that by trimming the budget that they're actually going to get instant gratification. Some of the things we have done in forming the red has offset much greater increases than people would have experienced. And we can't prove that with the numbers because we don't exist as we would have at that time. But trust me when I say we've done that. But people are also disappointed in, you formed this red, we were supposed to see a savings, and our taxes are going up in London, they're 12% this year. Why? So I just don't want everybody to get a false sense of hope here that you can do anything with the current system and realize instant gratification in your tax bill.
Don't disagree.
To the individual who asked about what an individual taxpayer might offer at this time, what actions they might take, as a school board member for UD 23, which is Mount Tabor Danby, operates Courier School. We're a small schools grant school.
Alumni.
Pardon?
Alumni.
There you go. I would suggest that now more than ever, school boards are looking for individual voter input so that we understand what it is taxpayers are looking for from us. Act 46 leaves a lot of avenues open. The problem with that is there's so many choices, and we need input from taxpayers, from voters, to understand where to head down that path. There are almost infinite choices, and that is a lot to deal with as a school board member. We're doing the best we can to navigate and give good choices, but we literally have 1 to 2 members of the public at any given meeting. It's great to come to the annual meeting. I really appreciate any voter who's willing to come out to a February meeting, but it doesn't always do the trick because at that point the majority of our decisions are made. So I would encourage every voter in any town, not just ours, to come to any board meeting that they're available for.
Great. I hope everybody heard that comment from, just to repeat it, your school board members want to hear from you. And not just at the annual meeting, don't just show up and vote on the budget, but actually throughout the year. They're looking, especially as part of this process, school board members really do want to hear from you. So Jim and then John.
I was just curious about, the governance change. It has a lot of potential to have, significant positive educational impact, and that's definitely what we're after. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are expecting a cost impact. We're having questions about taxes. And
speak up.
Okay. Having, we're looking for educational improvements, but at the same time, a lot of people are looking for an impact on costs and ultimately property taxes. Just curious of whether the legislature has in mind, what the actual cost impacts could be or should be from, enacting Act 46 throughout the state.
Dave, you want to take this one?
So the Business Managers Association, BASBO, I think is their acronym, they told us $30 million. And they're redoing their estimates now, I understand, to come up with a more accurate or more recent figure. Our Joint Fiscal Office, which is charged with the responsibility of evaluating the financial impacts of anything we do, said somewhere between $25 and $50 million. Since the decisions, Chittenden East is expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 in savings. Now, what they do with that money, they can choose to return that to taxpayers, or they can choose to add a French teacher, or increase educational opportunities for their students. We don't control that in the legislature, so it's difficult to say, what the impact is going to be on the education fund and on statewide tax rates. But those are some of the numbers that we got feedback on in testimony.
Could you put that in percentage? Because I just did some quick math. It's something like 1.5%. You're talking about the total education budget?
It's a small number in a $1.5 billion enterprise. 30 million is not much. On the other hand, if it's all returned to taxpayers, that's 3 cents on the tax rate.
But those are I would consider those to be short-term savings. Act 46. Short term, I don't think it's going to have a dramatic impact. I think we need to be looking at the longer term. And again, this isn't just about immediate cost savings. This is also about putting our overall government education structure on a sustainable path forward. This is not solving out 1 or 2 years or 3 years out. This is solving 10, 20, 30 years out, a generation. So I'm going to take just a couple more questions. John, you were next in the queue. And then we'll get the gentleman in the back. And then I know I want these guys are probably need to get home here before it gets too much later. So John, quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, and you said earlier that your local taxes entirely depend entirely on your local spending, and people should go to their local school boards. And I absolutely agree, but I also want to point out that like last year, we decreased our per pupil spending by 1.5% here, but our school spending went up 5%, and that's because the state-based tax rate was raised. So it's not all local spending. We're paying for the whole state. So as long as statewide expenses are going up, our taxes are going up. And it matters a little bit what we do here, but sometimes it matters a lot more what goes on statewide. So even though our spending went down, our taxes went way up, and that was because of increases statewide and not what goes on at the local level. I also, though, want to say that as one of our local school board members, we really would love people's input, especially when it comes to Act 46. We really need to make really important decisions in this next coming year or so. We will likely have to merge with other districts, and we're looking for public input on what's going to work best for our kids and our families. So we don't want to do it alone.
So I'm just going to ask Dave and Shap to get up here and just offer some closing comments. And I know folks are anxious to move out of here. So if you guys have any final words of wisdom for us.
So from our perspective, this was a very difficult conversation in the legislature. Like the speaker alluded to earlier, there's no political advantage in doing this. It's recognizing that we have a crisis in our state in education. We are not delivering the kind of education that we need to deliver to some of the students in this state, and it's costing us a lot of money. And we need to make changes in how we deliver education in order to do a better job and in a way that taxpayers can afford to pay. And it was a difficult process. Our committee worked really hard on this, and we managed to pass this out of our committee with a unanimous vote, 11-0 vote. That's members of both the major parties. And we passed it in the legislature on the floor of the House with what I like to call the responsible middle. We lost people on the fringes, but it was a bipartisan, tripartisan vote to move forward on this. And what is really gratifying to me as the chair of the committee who shepherded this bill and on behalf of my committee members who I know this was a difficult vote for them as well, to see the response statewide, the recognition that, oh yeah, this really is something we need to do. There are conversations happening across this state about how we can do a better job for our kids and do it within a cost that we can afford that's really exciting. And I am hopeful about the future of education in this state. So thank you for coming out tonight. I appreciate the conversations. The difficulty of the conversations that we had in the legislature is now in your laps, and you have equally, if not more difficult conversations to go through as communities to try to figure this out for our students. But I am very much excited about the fact that people are engaged and having these conversations.
I don't even know if I need to say anything after that. I'm a product of the public school system in Vermont, for good or for ill, depending on your viewpoint. It's part of who I am. The concept of making sure that we have an education system that can support our kids so that they can have the skills necessary for their future economic opportunities, but also so that they can be good citizens, so that they can be part of our society in a day and age where our society is fraying oftentimes because people do not have the underpinning that they need to be successful in life and as citizens. That's our obligation. That's why we're all here today. And we also know that we are in a constantly changing environment, and this is about change. This bill is about change. And it's difficult. Change is difficult. There is no two ways about it. But this system, the last time we really did significant governance change was in the 1890s. I think it's worth having the conversation every 125 years or so to see whether we are doing it the right way. This has been an incredible evening for me to hear the feedback from you in a really, really calm and just an incredible conversation. I must admit that I was prepared for a little more heat. But I mean, I think this is really an acknowledgement from everybody in this room, and this is happening all around the state, that we are at a time and a place where change is happening, and we all want to be part of it, and we want to make sure it's the best thing for the state and for the state's kids. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the work that we all together have to do for the future of our state and the future of our children. So thanks.
I want to thank Dave and Shap personally for making the trek down here to speak for you guys, to hear your concerns. And I want to thank our local educators, our local school board members who are wrestling with this process. And I really want to thank all of you for taking the time, making the time this evening to talk about, what quite frankly can be some pretty dense material. But this is an incredibly important conversation. This is going to define how we educate Vermont students for at least another generation, if not two. And the key to making this successful is engaging with, with all of you, and I really appreciate that. So, again, thanks for coming out. I hope that you found this helpful. I mean, what an incredible state. I mean, what other state could you come to a meeting about something like this and have the Speaker of the House, the Chairman of the State Board of Education, the superintendents, the Chair of the House Education Committee come down and speak before us all and listen to what we have to say. And it's pretty phenomenal. So anyway, hopefully you found this useful, and I just want to thank you all, and I'll let you go.